Observera, which of course is Swedish for Achtung, Achtung. Did you like? I should do it more like the Swedish chef, shouldn't I? Should I?
Yeah.
Observera. That's Dutch. And let's not worry about it.
Observera will do.
That'll do. It's Achtung, isn't it, in Swedish, isn't it, James?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course it is.
Now, this is We Have Ways of Making You Talk, the Second World War podcast. I'm Al Murray, comedian and history buff.
And I'm James Holland, historian of the Second World War, author and broadcaster.
And we're back in Bovington, home of the Tank Museum, and currently the home of our podcast. And with us is David Willey, the curator. Great to have you here, David.
Yep, brilliant, man. Thank you.
He's here to correct our mistakes, so you don't have to online. Okay, but we're only really here to talk about one thing today, and that... what have you been up to? Before we get into the meat of it, what have you been up to, James?
Well, I've had an amazing time in the last couple of weeks because I've been in Guadalcanal down in the Solomon Islands on the far side of the world.
What, on holiday?
Yeah.
Come on, babes, let's go to Guadalcanal for the weekend.
Well, I've got to say, Rachel wasn't that keen on the idea. 30 hours to get there, then just look at lots of war debris. But boy, was there a lot. It's absolutely amazing. It is,
yeah.
Because, well, the thing is, it's never really been cleared up because they're not a particularly wealthy country and no one's particularly interested and no one... apart from mad people like me, get there. And so there's just crap everywhere. I mean,
Really?
you get up onto Galloping Horse, which was this big feature that the American Army, actually, rather than the Marines, attacked towards the end of the campaign. And there's foxholes galore. I found a Japanese machine gun magazine.
It'd be remarkable if you found a German one. I mean,
wouldn't it? But loads of sort of, remnants of grenades, shrapnel,
wow.
bullets, literally just stuff everywhere. And we also went on to Bloody Ridge, which of course is where John Basilone gets his Medal of Honor, and the perimeter wire was still there, and lots of old caps of hand grenade tins just lying on the ground. I mean, it was amazing.
Well, I've been in Chelmsford.
Yeah, your tour started, hasn't it?
The state of Chelmsford, it's not a rich place, it's still in the state it was 70 years ago, etc. Anyway, and I had a lot... Oh, yes, I've started touring.
You started touring.
All over the country, Landlord of Hope and Glory, book now to avoid disappointment.
And how many more to go?
I think it's 45, but I tend to not look at the diary and count the dates because then I'd never do it. I'd say, actually, no, I'm staying at home.
Yeah. And what about Monty? Is he with you this time?
Monty isn't on this tour, but now you've reminded me, I think he may join us. And
you should take Rommel this time.
Well, maybe the pair of them. Anyway, we are here in front to talk about D-Day, and I think we're looking right up the backside of exactly the right thing to talk about D-Day, which is a DD tank, the Sherman Duplex Drive.
It's bonkers, isn't it?
Well, because it epitomises. I mean, I think the hardware like this epitomises the Allied ingenuity and the technological approach to the invasion of Normandy. Because, I mean, it's a tank, but it can swim.
Exactly. I mean, what I love about so much of the kind of Allied kit, particularly the stuff that they're preparing for Normandy, is just how outside the box it is. I mean, Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris hated it. He called these people panacea mongers, people who felt there was a sort of shortcut by thinking of wacky things like bouncing bombs and stuff. But look at this. I mean, look at it. Okay, so I can see, I'm looking at it now.
Yeah, describe it.
Okay, so I can see that familiar tank tracks of a Sherman tank, but it's surrounded by a great big rectangular canvas canopy, which at the time you would waterproof. There would be a sort of propeller at the back, wouldn't there, David? And you'd literally launch off a landing craft and try and swim through the sea.
So
I mean,
this is the Archimedes principle writ large, isn't it? This is displacement of water. David, take us through the DD.
So what we're looking at is a 30-ton Sherman tank. They've put a screen round the outside of to displace, as you say, displace the water so it'll float. If you look on the canvas, about 3 foot from the top, there's a black line painted. And that's
its plimsoll line, right?
Exactly. All being well, that's where it will float. The water level should come to. So any waves,
a leap of faith, isn't it?
Any waves over 3 foot. Now they start off. This is a Hungarian. Nicholas Strausler comes up with the idea. Look, we're always going to have this problem. How do we get tanks across a river, across a lake? How do we get them onto a beach potentially? And this issue, he comes up with the idea. Put a screen around something, and he starts off with a Tetrarch. He does a Valentine tank, and the actual ones that are going to be used on D-Days are these Shermans. But the issue behind it is back to D-Day itself. What's the problem? The issue is if we bung all our tanks in one landing craft, send it towards the beaches, if that ship goes down,
I think you're talking eggs in one basket, aren't you?
You've got that as a real problem.
Yeah.
So this idea, and they know because of the intelligence, the photo reconnaissance, the resistance reports, the Germans aren't stupid. They don't have all their guns facing out to sea. They're lined up to fire diagonally or along parallel to the beach, and they're defended from the seaward side. So even if we've got our destroyers coming in, we need armoured support on the beach with the infantry straight away. Now, we've had that disaster at Dieppe in 42. We're going to learn the lessons from this. We're going for beaches rather than going for a port, because when we go to Dieppe, it's really heavily defended. We have a lot of trouble, and we've got clever ideas out there with engineer tanks, things they've been thinking about, but Dieppe is the one that crystallises the idea that we are going to have to put a formation together. Let's do some specialised armour, and that will include these amazing DD floating tanks. And how the hell are we going to, what's the problem? You come to us and we'll find a way to help sort out getting your army on the beaches.
Now, this is a British innovation, isn't it?
This one, if you call Strausser, he's actually Hungarian working in Britain.
But he's doing it with the British Army. The Americans, because I think one of the, in fact, I think in anticipation of us coming and talking about this, we had a question from Jonathan who said, why did the Americans launch their DDs 6,000 yards out from their beaches, when they were advised to launch them for 3,000 yards out, and they sank, and so they didn't get the armour support on the beach when they needed it. It's Omaha Beach, famously, where the DDs failed. What's that about?
Well, there's 2 battalions, and one of them does, one of them does launch them a really far way out. But the other one goes, actually, no, I'm not going to launch them here because that would be mad, because the weather's really rough and there's a tide current coming across them. That's not going to work. I'm going to let them in really much closer. And all but 2, I think, reach the shore.
Right.
So. But where they put them far away out, then obviously, they do get wrecked. And they've done all this marine archaeology, which has shown why they all sank. And it's because their aiming point was this church spire at Colville.
Yep.
And they were launched further out, and they were cutting across. So the current was coming at 90 degrees to the angle at which they were hurtling, or not, going very slowly, rather, I should say, towards the beach. And so they all got swamped. Is that right, David?
Yeah, and we have this business as well. The British, we had the advantage, if you want to put it that way, exercise Smash down the road from here. Before D-Day, you were looking at April and May. What the British find out is when the seas are rough, the risk to these vehicles, and they're actually practicing down in Poole Harbour with Valentine floating tanks, a number of them get swamped in rough weather. So the British pick up very quickly that let's take the risk of going closer if we can, if it looks like we can get in there. So the British beaches, in some of the areas they take them closer in. Actually, some of them, again, we still actually launch as 5,000 yards out. That's a long way. Some of these tanks took an hour to float in and get to the beaches.
Bloody hell.
But at the same time, so again, this is part of that whole, the planning for D-Day and what actually happens on D-Day. It doesn't always go to plan full stop. We know that. But this idea that certainly for the British, and there's British commanders are actually talking to the Americans off Omaha, why not go in a bit closer? No, we're going to launch 5,000 yards. The thing to remember as well is actually tanks do get ashore at Omaha, but they're deep wading tanks, they're not the floating ones. So the idea there's no actual tank support is a bit of a myth. But these...
there are multiple myths around Omaha anyway, which I think we're going to maybe touch on.
Yeah, I think it's worth talking about some of these ones. But the idea, the key thing to remember with these things is it's the first time they've been used.
Yeah.
So there's that shock and awe factor of all of a sudden, and there's a German account of they thought these are canvas boats coming ashore. The screen drops down, and Germans for, oh, fuck, it's a tank. Because genuinely, that, it hasn't happened. What idiot's going to float a 30-ton tank? And to come up on the beach. And there's areas where, again, with this, where you read some of the accounts, the confusion, the things going on, but suddenly a tank appears and starts taking out that pillbox.
How big, the last podcast when we talked about tank technology, we looked at the Tiger tank. How big a skirt would a Tiger tank have needed to float? Because this is 30 tons. Is a Tiger tank's what?
56.
56. Yeah. So, impossible. So...
But the principle there, and I'd go back to, so what are we looking at here? We're looking at a series of problems that the D-Day landings are going to put up. We've had that Dieppe experience. What's your problem? come to us, and that is the engineers, the scientists, and then with the 79th Armoured Division, this group that comes together to actually look after this specialised armour. And really what they're saying is, okay, if we've got a bit of blue clay, soft ground, okay, you've got a problem there, the Coppets team find out about this, let's, these guys that are coming through the surf, in diving suits, the January the 1st, 1944, they're on the beaches finding this blue clay. If it's blue clay, a tank's going to sink. Let's come up then with bobbing. We're going to put a tank ashore with a great roll of matting. We can drive over that. These are guys looking at a problem. What can we answer?
So this is in direct. If this is in direct contradiction to the idea that, for instance, the Germans are doing all the technological snazziness, and they're the people pushing the engineering boundaries. This is a canvas skirt that's been put in a tank, but that's as innovative and as smart as anything that the Germans come up with technologically for their tanks during the war, isn't it? I mean, arguably.
You can, and you've got a really big specific problem. If we're looking at D-Day, we cannot countenance a risk of another Dieppe, okay?
Yep.
If we fail. So we are looking, even if some of these things turn out to be amazing successes on the day, we are looking at those as a problem, and what the hell can we come up with to answer that?
Yeah.
And in Britain, we have some really clever people and some great innovation.
How many of these were there? How many Sherman DDs did we build in the end?
No idea.
Oh,
I've got two.
got him!
I've got
Finally
two
got him!
I've got two
Yes!
questions for you. So the first one is when you listen to people talking about that, the crews are always saying, "Oh, we were waterproofing our DD tank or waterproofing our tank." What does waterproofing involve? Obviously, putting up the screen, but are you then covering it in Vaseline or something? I mean, what is that? What's involved?
So with different tanks, you've got different things going. So DD tanks are the duplex drive. It stands for propellers at the back, or you can drive on your tracks. Two ways of driving. Now, this canvas screen is erected by compressed air inside, and it's got actual tubes inside and struts that then hold it out when it's launched, and then off it goes and chugs through the water with the propellers propelling it forward at the back.
Yeah.
Now, that canvas is actually waterproof. Quite often, before the D-Day landings, when you hear about everyone's waterproofing their vehicles, we also have deep wading tanks, which what they do is they put little vents above the exhaust and they gum up everything with something called and they have something called Bostic, which is a kind of mixture of a paste that they use that and balloon canvas to seal all sorts of areas around the vehicle. It goes for deep wading, so if you have a wave that floods over your engine deck, it won't cut out the engine. The fact it's higher up and it can still get air into the engine, etc. So there's a number of things that they're talking about when they're saying they're actually waterproof.
The thing is, if you come to the museum, there's a window in the canvas here, and you can get a glimpse of all the mechanisms and stuff.
Right, but how do you see? That's my second. My second question is, how do you look at this?
Right. So when you're going ashore, the commander is at the back, and he's actually got a tiller arrangement. He talks to the driver down the front as well. The driver's normally about the one crew member who has to sit in the vehicle. And they give the crew escape apparatus, a bit like Davis escape apparatus, which the submariners use. So it's got just enough oxygen in a little chest rig. And think about this, you're on a 30-ton tank. If that water floods over, you go down like a stone. So they make sure that they keep it very small, so you're not going to get trapped in your hatch if it does go down, and they go down on training exercises. There's footage of them coming off the end of a landing craft, bit too steep an angle, water over the front. So you've got that, as I said, 3-foot freeboards, not much on a choppy day on the on the English Channel.
There's a hole in the canvas here. I mean,
this one is the last remaining one with its canvas there. And if I'm honest, we can't really depress the canvas anymore because it's a rubberized canvas. Exactly, it's got brittle over time, and the screen was put in because so many people walk past.
Oh yeah, look. So this is rubber on the other side. So that's what makes it waterproof.
And it's hopefully sealed, but you can imagine the guys are actually, there's descriptions of them coming into shore, leaning back against the canvas as the waves are battering them, trying to make sure this thing doesn't suddenly collapse and they're all suddenly bobbing around on the ocean.
Well,
cost nerves of steel to go.
It's just another one of those things, another one of those Second World War things where I think, thank God I was born in 1968. Now, you have an object for us, David.
Yeah, one thing I just thought is worth us talking about. So when we go through all these issues, that, were we any good in the war, things we pick up on. This is one of those areas. 79th Armoured Division was a brilliant British creation, and it's getting somebody put in charge of it who's got imagination, innovation, and knows what he's up to. And they get this idea, and take it back a little bit. There's a guy called Percy Hobart. He joins the Royal Engineers in 1904. He has a great First World War, gets a military medal. He ends up DSO, captured by the Turks. In the 20s and 30s, great advocate of tanks. Now off he goes, and he does a lot of training of British armour. And this he becomes famous for. He's a brilliant trainer in Maine. He trained to one of the Royal Tank Regiments, or Tank Corps at the time. And then, just before the war, he's sent out to North Africa. And he's there to train the 7th Mobile Division, or it's basically the 1st Armoured Division we're putting together there. Falls out with a guy called Jumbo Wilson, who's the guy in charge of him. And
Later Supreme Allied Commander in the Mediterranean.
Absolutely. And he's sent back, and basically he's of an age now where he's put on the retired list. Thank you very much, don't need you anymore. So what does he do? He joined Chipping Campden Home Guard, all right? And this is the actual pike he was issued with, which, if you look at it, what I'm holding is a bit of scaffolding pole and
good old-fashioned know where you stand 17-inch sword bayonet.
Exactly, First World War bayonet welded to the top there, and that is what Percy Hobart, as a corporal in the Chipping Campden Home Guard, was going to defend Britain with.
My God.
And as we know, they don't like it up them.
No, they said, don't panic.
So what happens is Churchill, there's a bit of a campaign, one or two people, Little Heart, writes to the papers and said, look, you've got these really clever guys, great trainer of men, get him back. So Churchill has a word with Brooke. Alan Brooke asks Hobart to the War Office. Again, there's this wonderful correspondence where Hobart's saying, do you want me to come in my corporal's outfit? How do you want me to dress to the War Office, etc.? He walks in as a corporal in the Chipping Campden Home Guard. He walks out as a Major General. And he's first put in charge of 11th Armoured Division to train it, and then put in charge of the 79th Armoured Division, which is going to be another armoured division ready for the invasion of Europe. They realise after Dieppe, we're going to actually concentrate our specialist armour, and he's put in charge of that. And it's one of those moments where an old guy who's hit retirement age finds his moment. He is a brilliant trainer of men, and he's famous as well because he's got the government chief scientific advisor standing next to him who explains how these things work. Next minute, he turns to his driver, who's a corporal, and says, what do you think of this? He will take good ideas from anything. And his moment comes. That pike, he ends up in 1945 commanding the largest armoured force in Europe.
Am I right in thinking he was Montgomery's brother-in-law?
Yeah, his sister marries Monty.
Small world, there we go.
And again, that peculiar world, they are related. And again, he's a fascinating character because you get some people who obviously, he's prickly, he's irascible, he argues with people, he doesn't get on with, doesn't suffer fools gladly, but boy, does he want to make his unit successful.
Last time I came here, I remember you telling me some of that story, but also a story about when he had a load of tanks lined up and he said, well, what's the story?
So he's another one, he doesn't take crap.
Yeah.
So bullshit is not his métier at all. So he looks at this wonderful parade of tanks lined up, all polished, all looking lovely, turns around to the CO at the end of the parade and says, right, now start them all up. Because, in other words, do they damn well work?
Yeah.
That's the important thing, not what it looks like.
Bullshit, of course, in that context. Civilian context, it means something slightly different. The military context of bullshit is blanco and polished boots and shiny buttons and everyone stood in straight lines and all that, and the stuff that people maybe think characterises the military. And there is a history of soldiers who, officers particularly, like, I'm not interested in that bullshit. That's what it means in that context.
Yeah, I think as well that one other really key thing that comes across about Hobart is this ability he has to train people well. And there's another issue as well, which is, of course, for the build-up to D-Day, is we've got to get this done in a hurry.
Yeah.
There is a deadline, and one of the things that you pick up on, he shoots around the country in this staff car, they call it the Blue Bottle, and it shoots around the place at breakneck speed. He is a man on a mission, and he's got to get this done in time. And one thing, even though we talk about this amazing planning that goes on, some of these vehicles are only just arriving, just in time.
And they're essentially experimental types.
And David, we're standing right next to the crocodile, which I've got to say is one of my favourites. So for those who don't know, this is a Churchill tank that is also a flamethrower, and it can spew a jet about 120 yards of a mixture of oil and rubber, and it's effectively napalm, isn't it?
Napalm, yeah.
It's horrible.
Yeah, it's another one of those weapons where the idea's been around quite some time. Flame weapons, goes back to Chinese. It's absolutely amazing stuff that's been going on.
Goes all the way back to Westeros.
Absolutely, yeah, it does. But what you've got here, it's part, again, they look at the Churchill tank because it's heavily armoured.
Yes.
So you've actually got more armour on the front of a Churchill than you have on a Tiger.
Yes.
So from that point of view, even though it's relatively slow, it's got good levels of protection and it's got some space inside. So what they do is they bung a trailer on the back, which this tank will actually pull behind it. Within the trailer are pressurised tanks that will force through this jellied petrol, like napalm, to the bow machine gun position that's at the front. And that's where there's a squirting jet that comes out in the machine gun position. It will
it's
squirt
unbelievable, isn't
and
it?
light. There's a little lighter at the end of it. So this then becomes a flame jet. And famously, this is a weapon. Quite often there's descriptions of it being, they'd just turn up, they'd flame a tree, they'd flame somewhere nearby, and that was enough to persuade whoever's opposite, put your hands up, I'm not going to fight.
Well, from my research into this, I would say that German troops feared this more than Allied troops feared a Tiger.
Yeah, and it's one of those areas where, because it was also, and this is this other weird thing, certain weapons were looked at as unsporting. And there's stories of crocodile crews being quietly executed because this was not what was the done thing. Flame weapons, no one wants to burn.
Yeah, because the SS were really good about playing fairer.
Yeah, of course. Right, well, we're going to take a break now. We'll be back in a minute. This thing is terrifying. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. We're discussing all things D-Day, tanky things D-Day. Before we continue, a couple of your tweets. Here's a marvellous one from the wonderfully named You Can Call Me Al, who says, this really is an excellent podcast. I like listeners with taste, don't you, James?
Oh, I do.
This really is an excellent podcast. I'm going to read that again. This really is an excellent podcast to the point of making me visit the Imperial War Museum on my day off today. Oh, it's spreading,
that is good.
Spreading the joy.
And here's a highly relevant bit of history from Bagus, who says, or is that Bagus or Bagus?
Bagpuss. I don't know.
Bagus, who says, brilliant podcast as ever. Shout out to the Didcot, Southampton and Newbury railway line, which saw huge numbers of traffic. Part of the line was doubled up in 1943 to supply the armies before, during and after D-Day. Absolutely.
Is this a Second World War nerd train spotter crossover moment?
I think it is, but I'm happy with that.
I think it could be. I'm quite delighted with that. And here's one from David Melanti, who contacted us to say about D-Day. I spoke to an ex-signals officer who said the whole thing began a few days earlier than is known. Parts of Old Mulberry were sent from secret moorings near Warsash, Hamble in Hampshire. In fact, stuff was coming down from Glasgow for the Mulberry, wasn't it? And set off early.
All the big companies were doing it. Balfour, BT, McAlpine.
Yeah. And they kept it quiet.
Yep.
Extraordinary.
Fascinating.
Now,
anyway, we are now in the
where are we?
We are in the conversation area, but we're also in the conservation centre. David, where are you leading us to?
Right, I'm just wanting you to have a look at this. This is basically where we are, is our whopping great big storage shed.
Yep.
That, very grateful to the Heritage Lottery Fund, various other funding bodies, which meant that we could put a lot of the collection that had been scattered around. Some were gate guards, some were outside, some were in areas where the public couldn't get access to. But you'll see as we go through this door...
And this is open to the public, isn't it?
This is, you can come in here as well. We open this every day.
Oh, my God! Look at that! Oh,
yes.
Wow. Okay, so what we're looking at here is a massive hangar, absolutely jammed full of tanks from every conceivable era.
Bumper to bumper.
This reminds me of that photograph of that field near Isigny-sur-Mer, which is where they put all the kind of knocked out tanks from Normandy. And it looks just like this, except these all look in substantially better nick. How absolutely amazing. Okay, so I'm looking at a Churchill down there, a Sherman.
In desert colours.
Desert colours.
Yeah.
First World War tank down here.
So I've got to interrupt
Holy
you here
moly.
because this is for me. It's always the pleasure of the moment where when you actually let people walk into this space and they look, and we're on a balcony overlooking it all.
Okay, I'm getting on my camera and taking a picture
That
here.
wow moment where everybody gasps.
You're telling
and
me?
we're all back to being schoolboys again, trying to do, is that what I think it is? Is that what and everything else that way. And it does have that wow factor of armour. About a third of the vehicles in here are runners. Some of the ones are vehicles we're going to work on in the future. And basically, it's almost like the reserve store. There's a lot of interesting items in here, but stuff we haven't at the moment got display room on the galleries, or we're going to rotate through over time.
So will any of this stuff be out at Tankfest, David?
Yeah, so end of June, Tankfest, we've got a number of vehicles here will be going out running. We also bring guest vehicles in. So, for example, this year, 2019, we've got a Panther coming from the French that will be running. We've got the Dutch bringing over stuff. So we also have modern armour as well as the earlier in World War II stuff. And, of course, down below us, this is our replica Mark IV First World War tank, which was originally copied from one of our tanks here. It was used in the War Horse movie. And for us now, that's brilliant because we can use it. We don't want to use the First World War ones because they're so delicate now.
What about that Churchill? Sorry.
You see what I mean about schoolboy stuff?
What about that Churchill?
So that's a Churchill that we think saw service actually over in Italy. And it was a gate guard. So some of the vehicles we've got in here, sometimes from a distance they look pretty good. You get a bit closer and you realise they've been sat outside. So this one here is, for example, if you just look at the cupola, where the glass should be, they've actually just got wiring in there to stop kids putting their fingers in. So some of these vehicles here, there's a Sherman further along, the one with B-43, that's with a 105mm gun. The larger the howitzer that was put on the Sherman. There's some experimental stuff. There's a Sherman recovery here, 1930s British armoured cars. As you work your way round, there's a Swedish tank here. Doesn't it look like a German pre-war? This one here, the M40, that's good. Hans Vollmer, who designs the A7V in World War I, goes to Sweden, learns his art, helping them develop a tank, and then goes back to Germany to help in the Panzer program. Right. So, you see some of these connections here, and one of the issues we have, of course, is trying to look after them, but also where we can, if we can get them running, because one of the things we do here at Bovington is try and run tanks, and that helps people understand the issues. Because when you see one of these things coming towards you, back to that, static in the museum looks lovely. When it's moving, suddenly you start understanding the fear factor, the noise it makes, the ground shakes, the screeching, the rumbling, the tracks working. You understand these are things that are going to wear out quickly. They are not like your car.
Yeah. Well, they're not. I mean, the residence parking permit for that Comet there would be more than the 80 quid I pay at the moment. I love the Comet, though.
It's a beautiful looking tank, isn't it?
It's a beautiful looking tank.
And back to British successful tank design, that, in the back there, you've got the Meteor engine, D-rated, basically the Merlin from the Spitfire. You've got fishtail exhaust on the rear. You've got this fantastic gun. Looks like a 17-pounder. Actually, they called it the Vickers 77mm high-velocity gun. It has got that, was discarding Sabo ammunition on that comment, had more penetration than the gun on a Panther.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I'm pretty blown away by that. That's amazing.
If you're not gobsmacked when you come here, there's something wrong with you. Right, okay. I'd like to know, we have some questions now. We have some questions. I'd like to know more about the D-Day subterfuge op, says A Perfect Fifth, whereby the Allies clandestinely and heavily bought the Swedish stock market to suggest a landing in Norway.
Well, Churchill was absolutely obsessed with Norway. And apparently whenever there was a kind of sort of future operations meeting, he'd always go, well, I'd like to suggest Norway. And everyone would sort of go, yeah, okay, fine, whatever. But what they did do as part of Operation Fortitude, which is the deception plan before D-Day, they did put a whole load of troops up in Scotland to kind of keep the Germans guessing. And it's very interesting when you look at the discussions that are going on at the OKW, the German General Staff, and with Hitler and everything. 1 minute they're going, well, I really think, it's likely that the Allies are going to land in Norway. Yeah, I really think they're going to be landing in the Pas de Calais. Do you know what? I think they might actually land in the south of France. Yeah, I think they might land in Norway again. And, it just goes round and round and round and round. So although they never do actually launch a landing in Norway, it is certainly a hot topic for Churchill. He's very keen on, he's obsessed with Norway.
Well, but the Americans wouldn't, because the Americans in the end, they wanted to fight directly. They wanted to take the Germans on directly in France.
And it doesn't make a lot of sense,
No, it doesn't make any sense at all, really. And there were kind of the Churchill was fighting. You can look at it that Churchill's fighting a sort of classic 18th century campaign where what you do is you use your navy, descend as they used to call it, on various foreign outposts, and use your logistic power in the form of the Navy and force the enemy to fight at arm's length, like the Peninsula Campaign, like what Wellington's doing in Portugal, where the French are drawn to fight him and worn out at arm's length because that's what we can afford to do. And Churchill, you can argue, is thinking like that. I mean, North Africa, we've got to fight in North Africa because the oil, but Italy, the Balkans, Greece. I mean,
actually,
the landings he's doing.
I hate to contradict you there, Al, but the oil is only supporting operations in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. So most of oil for
yes,
Britain
but I'm
comes
saying
from
if the
America.
Germans had got their hands on oil, it would have changed things greatly. Because I mean, we've been talking about vehicles where there's not enough fuel and not
they've
enough
still
oil.
got to transport it though. So
Yeah. But
yeah.
you get my point. Thanks very much.
The key one there with fortitude, though, of course, is why you're doing this is so the Germans genuinely cannot put their forces together in one place, though they're spread out around the place. So the fact that in Norway they're keeping German soldiers till 1945 with tanks, with resources, with supplies, that's brilliant because it means they cannot be used either on the Eastern Front or against us, obviously, in the Normandy campaign. So that
keep
business about, keep them guessing, keep them spread.
And, of course, because of Allied air power, any attempt to move them will be really, really tricky.
Yes. The only thing I'd say about Normandy is I think, if you were German, if you were really thinking about it logically, it's a pretty obvious place that they might well land. I mean, if you think about it, Norway's unlikely because of all the reasons we just talked about. Pas-de-Calais is sort of unlikely because it's so well defended there and it's just too obvious. Anywhere else is, by the time you get into Brittany, southern France, all the rest of it, it's all getting a little bit too far and away and a bit too remote. So the only other place really is Normandy. Rommel actually favours kind of either side of the Seine, doesn't he? He thinks that's where it's most likely. The Normandy coastline, is a good a bet as any. And there's this big debate about where to put the 10 Panzer divisions or 9 Panzer divisions and 1 Panzer Grenadier division, where to put them. Should you put them close to the coast or should you keep them spread apart over the whole of the kind of sort of Atlantic wall or northwest Europe and southern France so that you sort of, you're not kind of putting all your eggs in one basket. But actually, I think it would have been perfectly possible to put most of the Panzer divisions roughly kind of in that kind of stretch between Normandy and kind of, Calais. That would be most sensible to me, and they just don't.
They don't. Well, no, but we come back to the last podcast where if you need a Tiger tank, explain Hitler. And I think we can explain a lot of this. The command, basically the command structure and culture in the German is all over
very
the place.
Divisive. That's the thing to remember
divisive.
as well. Yeah, what seems logic to us in wartime Germany with the Nazi Party in power, the logic doesn't always add up in ways that we would think that way, and that's another thing. So whether it's industry, whether it's the Wehrmacht, whether it's OKW, whether it's decision-making processes, when Hitler's involved or rival figures, suddenly things are going wrong.
Yeah.
So I've got a question from Antman1805 who says, why isn't the name Stan Hollis more well known? Only VC earned on D-Day. A forgotten person, surely. Can you tell his story?
Well, I think you can tell a story better than me, but what I think is really interesting about D-Day is there is only one VC, which indicates, of course, that it's been a massive success. Because Victoria Crosses tend to be dished out when things have really gone horribly wrong. Rorke's Drift is how do you distract from what's happened up the road? You give loads of VCs out. Arnhem, 5 VCs at Arnhem. Well, because it's a complete shit show. So of course you give out medals and you say, but we fought really gallantly and the men did their damnedest. So part of D-Day is striking that there is. I think I've always been sort of struck by that there is only one, because of course the Allied idea is about teamwork and that it's a shared effort and not necessarily having aces. But tell us about Stan Hollis, because I know it roughly, but you've a book out about Normandy, I believe, James.
Yes,
and
I
I'm
do.
sure
Yes,
he
thank you
surely
for
comes up
mentioning
in your book.
He does come up in my book. And actually, but I've walked the ground where he won his VC, every little bit of it, because it's actually a two-pronged action. But he's a fascinating character. He's a northerner, and what I love about him is he's got bad teeth. He doesn't look particularly brawny. He hasn't got that kind of sort of all-American, all-German kind of square-jawed look about him. But he was just plain talking. He started off life as a merchant seaman, didn't like it, went back, became a lorry driver, then joined up. He saw action throughout the Second World War. By the time it comes to D-Day, he's a company sergeant major, and he's tough as old boots. He's been there, seen it, got the T-shirt, and everyone completely respects him because he's just tough, says it as it is. So when they're getting issued condoms to put over their rifles to make sure they stay waterproof, he goes, I thought we were supposed to kill the Germans, not fuck them. And of course, it just lightens the mood. So he's a great one for just getting the mood of his men. And what he realises on D-Day, they're coming off at Vers-sur-Mer, which is kind of on the kind of eastern end of Gold Beach, 6th Green Howards, and they're coming off the beach. And they're getting attacked by this kind of strong point down, sort of overlooking the kind of main road as an anti-tank ditch. And he just charges up and takes him out of his Sten gun. The Germans are firing at him, and he jumps on the top of one bunker, chucks in a grenade, jumps around the back, shoots them all up with his Sten gun, then charges down a trench, attacks another one, takes lots of prisoners, and then later on the day there's an action up at Crepon, which is a kind of sort of village up on the hill, where he saves 2 of his guys who've been stranded. He's an absolute hero. I mean, he's a complete lad.
And of course, the real relevance here is, you're absolutely right in the sense of that idea that there is an action that's seen, which means you get the VC, because there's so many brave things going on that aren't necessarily recorded or seen. The other side of it is afterwards, what Stan Hollis do? He comes and becomes a pub landlord.
Well, then he's truly a legend. You can't argue with that, Ken.
There's an amazing bit when they have the longest day, and it's the premiere of the longest day in whenever it was, 1964 or 65. And they say to him, Mr. Hollis, we've got a German veteran here. We'd like to take a photo of you shaking his hand. He goes, fuck off, I'm not doing that.
As a complete sidebar, I heard a really good story about medals at the weekend from a friend of mine who used to be in the army, and his family are from Zimbabwe, so they knew this guy who was in the Rhodesian Squadron in the Air Force during the Battle of Britain. And apparently they were flying Hurricanes, and one of the squadron was a guy known as Elephant, because he was huge. He was too big, great big fat bloke, basically. And when they converted to Spitfires, he was too big to get in the Spitfire with a parachute, right? So he flew all of his Battle of Britain sorties without a parachute because he couldn't fit in the aeroplane with a parachute.
That's amazing.
Right? So then they got sent the squadron got sent 3 DSOs for the commanding officer to dish out at his discretion. So the commanding officer got one, obviously. One of the other lads who'd done something heroic got one, and then they gave one to Elephant as a matter of course because he'd been flying around without a parachute. So medals often would just come in the post, and obviously Stan Hollis is different. Right, now, I would be interested in your observations. Wendy's Boy writes, I would be interested in your observations on the following subject. What if the Americans had aborted the attack on Omaha Beach on the mid-morning of D-Day? How would they have done it? What would the change of plan have looked like? What would have been the implications? But because, of course, the reputation of the battle at Omaha Beach is that it was a very close-run thing, that the Americans were suffering extremely high casualties. And I've read certainly Ambrose. I've certainly read accounts where Bradley's in his cruise or whatever, and they have a chat where they say, we're gonna knock this on the head and transfer everyone to Utah Beach. So, James, you're pulling the let me shut up and let me speak face.
Well, it's very interesting. So, Bradley's chief aide was a chap called Major Chet Hansen, and Chet Hansen kept a very, very detailed diary of what's going on. And it's absolutely clear that from the USS Augusta, which is where Bradley is watching, he can't see diddly squat. The radio traffic is full of static, snatched words. It's very hard to kind of have the faintest idea what the slice is going on. At about 12:30, Bradley says to Hansen and to his chief of staff, right, I want you to get on the beach and tell me what the hell is going on. I just can't make head nor tail of this. So there's no sense of panic at all from Bradley.
He just doesn't know what's going on. He
just can't really see it. It all seems to be going fine. There's no sense of panic at all, right. I should hasten to add. He just wants to know what's going on. So he's not going to send off his chief of staff and his chief aide if he thinks they're 9 times out of 10 going to get shot up and killed the moment they set foot on the beach. So he sends them off, and they get onto the beach at about 1 o'clock, and there's a bit of stuff flying around, but it's sort of okay. There's lots of debris about, but Hansen and his chief of staff come back and they go, no, it all seems to be under control. And Hansen says in his diary, Bradley is the kind of image of calm. He doesn't seem in the slightest bit worried. I'm paraphrasing, but it's words to that effect. Then later, Bradley does an autobiography where he doesn't really suggest that he's that panic-stricken. And then he does a subsequent second autobiography where he does suggest that, actually it was all a bit scary and he was considering kind of pulling off and all that sort of stuff, and it crossed his mind. And I just think that is conforming to the post-war myth and the narrative that has built up about it. I mean, you pointed me in that direction of one book which really opened my eyes to Omaha Beach, that pointed out that one of the problems was not people being killed, it was just a lack of mobility, and that was due to a lack of leadership because assault platoons had been mixed up, the usual leaders they're trained with are being changed and all the rest of it. And it needed people to grip the situation. What is also really clear is when you look at after-action reports, yes, it is true that 2 landing craft were completely wiped out because a mortar landed in them. And it is true that in the initial waves opposite Colville and Verville, it was all a bit Saving Private Ryan-y, but it very quickly wasn't. And there were lots of people even landing in the first wave who got off the beach absolutely fine. And if you look at after-action reports of various company platoon commanders from the 116th, which was kind of the first among the first waves in the 29th Infantry on the kind of western side of the beach, a lot of them say, cross beach with 1 casualty, cross beach with 2 casualty, 1 dead, that kind of stuff. I mean, or no casualties at all. It's really not as bad as you think.
Well, then there's a question I have to ask you. What happened between 6th of June 1944 and Bradley's second autobiography, second memoir? Why did this thing build up around Omaha Beach?
Well, because the first 2 companies of the 116th did get absolutely decimated. Particularly, I can't remember if it was Company D or Company A. I think it was Company A. They got, it was like 90% casualties in the first couple of minutes. So obviously, that is your Saving Private Ryan moment. But what you have to understand is the number of Germans actually holding the crust is about 350. Yeah. I mean, there's 13 strong points directly overlooking that 5-mile beach.
Yeah.
There's 50 or
and if
15 with a few further back.
If you've been there and stand at the top of there, it's very striking. And you look down at the beach and you think, bloody hell, how did anyone get off here given the advantage of those positions?
Well, except that the thing about those bluffs is they curve downwards, so that if you're a German in there, you're in clear view the whole damn time. And across the whole of that beach, they've only got 85 machine guns, which might sound like quite a lot. And it is a lot to kill, that is a lot of killing power for infantry coming off a landing craft. But as we discussed with the MG42, it gets very erratic, very, very quickly, loses its accuracy. As long as you keep moving, you've got quite a good chance of survival. Again, in addition to that, there are about, I think there's 35 guns there along that entire coastline, of which 20 are field guns and 15 are anti-tank guns, or maybe it's the other way around. But there's only 2 88mm caliber, and the caliber is the kind of the size of the diameter of the shell. Yeah. Whereas opposing them are 183 guns of over 90mm diameter. I'm sorry, you're just not going to win against that. 2 under, there isn't one that, 183 guns of over 90mm caliber pounding at you all the time, lots of smoke. Every time you're in your bunker, you get hit. Now, it might not actually penetrate your bunker.
But that's
you might
not
be okay.
the point.
But bits are falling off, there's dust, there's smoke, you can't see diddly squat.
Yeah.
There's thousands of square-jawed Americans with great teeth coming towards you. You're just not going to win. And what happens is a domino effect. So once one strong point gets knocked out, it's only a matter of time before the others. And really, Omaha Beach is all over by 9 o'clock in the morning, really. There's still lots of fighting, there's still lots of danger, people are getting killed, but the outcome, I would say, is not in dispute by then.
Well, we hope that answers your question.
So, seriously, how it's interesting how many people are killed on Omaha Beach. Allied troops, and I say Allied because a lot of the coxswains on the landing craft are British.
British boats,
is 842. Which is a heck of a lot. Let's not beat about the bush. It's a huge number. But I suspect most people would have thought that the number of dead on Omaha Beach was considerably higher than that, at least 3 times higher than that.
Just backing that one up, if you actually read the after-action reports on each beach, the level of confusion you might be reading on a British beach that you're talking about Omaha.
Yeah.
So that level of confusion and what goes on and the problems that each beach seems to face, it's retrospectively we have this sifting action that we therefore have to come to sort of generalizations, conclusions and everything else, and somehow it's all very successful with us, etc. Actually, at the time, some of those reports, you know, the something's blowing up next to you, this vehicle's sinking over here. Actually, you could have picked them out and put them across all of those different beaches. It's just with the Omaha as well. When you physically go there, you cannot help but notice the geography overlooking in that manner that makes you feel actually
it's very striking. It's a very striking. I mean, the other interesting thing is they get off Omaha Beach and Utah Beach at kind of the same rate, and Utah's pretty much an unopposed landing, isn't it? So it's to do because they land in the wrong place as well. It's a lot to do. I mean, this is again we said this earlier. People get hung up on D-Day. It's as much as it's important what happens on D+1. +2.
Well, it really is. And what happens when the Canadians, you know, a couple of battalions of Canadian soldiers and a handful of Sherbrooke Fusiliers, Sherman tanks, come up against the full weight of the 1st Panzer Regiment, you know, an armoured brigade of the 12th SS. And the 12th SS get absolutely nowhere. Yeah. And that tells you one of two things. Either that the SS the 12th SS weren't very good, but actually we know that they're bristling with weaponry and motivation and discipline and all the rest of it, so they're not, you know, they're going to be pretty good. Or that the Canadians are absolutely amazing. Well, they definitely punch massively above their weight. Or, which is the reality, that going on the attack in Normandy is unbelievably difficult, which is really the situation.
Which is the story of the next 8 weeks. Yeah. Right. And John asks, was anything missed in the D-Day planning? What irrelevant things were included in the planning too? David, what do you think? Do you think anything was missed?
There is an argument that you could say some of that specialised armour, come the day, was it really necessary? Did it really do its job on the day? If the Americans didn't have that much specialised armour on Utah and yet they still landed successfully, managed to get through the German defences, was it a waste of time doing all those other things? It's a real tricky one to answer that in the sense of, because it's what if.
Yes.
And the only thing I would argue about with that specialised armour, it added to the morale.
Yep.
And that idea that when you're looking around you and you can see someone seems to have thought this issue through, even if it is not actually necessary on the actual day, that building a confidence level and giving your morale that we are thinking of your issues, chaps. We are going to come forward with an idea so you don't have this as a problem. And remember what happened before. We've got something. We're going ahead. We're thinking through those
problems. So your
problems.
cost-benefit analysis, as it were, has to include morale, has to.
And that's a really tricky one to then put into the equation to say, well, did we really need that? Should we have thought of something else? Did they really do anything? We talked earlier about the amazing crocodiles. You know, 3 of them ended up. You know, one of the ships was delayed. Only 3 land late in the day. So they weren't actually. Think of all that time, energy, effort. That particular moment on D-Day itself, they don't actually use their flame guns at all. So are we going to say that was a waste? No, of course it wasn't. Because those trained men, other people have seen it, and they are, as we say. So within 24 hours, they are flaming something, and that means that, you know, that was important that they were there ready to do it.
Yeah, I mean, they crossed the T's and dotted the I's, didn't they, for D-Day? I mean, for instance, the famous Pegasus bridge gliders, the sappers in those gliders had rubber dinghies with them in case the bridges were blown and they were going to have to get across the river anyway. You know, they'd gone that far into the detail contingency planning, hadn't they?
Yeah, I think it's really hard to fault the D-Day plan, and you know the only shortcoming really is they just don't have enough landing ships, which are these 100-meter long, 100-foot long rather, vessels that, you know, have a draft of kind of 4'7". They can take, you know, 2,100 tons or 18 tanks and 350 men. You know, they're really, really impressive bits of kit, and you know, they just don't have enough of them. They've got 237 instead of 277 or whatever it was they were expected to have, and they could have just done with another 100 of them. You know, that's a shortcoming, and perhaps they should have planned for those a little bit more. 100 metres, 100
metres, 100 foot's a bit titchy for 18 tanks.
Yeah, they don't have enough of those, but otherwise I don't really think you can fault it. I mean, I think they sort of... Things obviously don't go 100% according to plan, but... Yeah,
I was going to say the one thing that sometimes afterwards, well, after having a look at the geography of the landscape, all those different things, one thing that they did actually say is that idea of the bocage countryside should we have thought a little bit more about what the geography was going to impact on the nature of the fighting beforehand? So the
in the later campaign
after D-Day itself. So that's one area where perhaps we should have thought a little bit more
But
about
the Bocage
this.
cut both ways, because it created a situation where the Germans could be held close and attrited. I think, would we agree with that, James?
Definitely, 100%.
Fantastic! I got it right. Right. Well, I think we believe we may have got a foothold on the beach. This D-Day podcast, tanky edition, has gone well. We'll be in Berlin by Tuesday next week, I think.
Yeah, we will. And we should just flag up the fact that we're going to be recording a live podcast at the Chalk Valley History Festival on Saturday the 29th of June, aren't we?
Yes, at noon,
I
believe.
At noon. Yeah, so do come along.
Okay, get in touch, use our hashtag, We Have Ways. We're going to be talking more Normandy, aren't we? I think.
Yes, we are. And talking of which, new book out next week. This week.
Shameless.
No,
Bye for now.
sorry.
Cheerio. And a big thanks to David, of course, here at the Tank Museum.